On an overcast morning in the summer of 1945, as the dust of a shattered Europe drifted through the open windows of the Potsdam Conference Hall, Winston Churchill studied the new American president with a mixture of curiosity and deep unease. Harry S. Truman had been in office for only a few weeks. He had never attended a major international summit. He had never run a war, commanded armies, or shaped the destiny of nations. And now, with the world still smoldering from its greatest catastrophe, Truman found himself seated beside Churchill at the negotiating table, staring across at Joseph Stalin, the leader who already had half of Europe under his influence. Churchill had spent years inside the war rooms, poring over maps, arguing with generals, pleading with allies, and delivering speeches that lifted Britain from the edge of collapse. Truman had spent those same years in the U.S. Senate, respected but largely outside Roosevelt's inner circle. Churchill could feel the difference as plainly as the difference between a polished saber and a newly forged blade. To him, the early signs were unmistakable. Truman was inexperienced, untested, and ill-prepared for what was coming. But Churchill's concerns ran deeper than personality or pedigree. What worried him most was the moment itself. Europe's fate hung in the balance. The Soviet Union was consolidating power. The United States was still adjusting to Truman's sudden rise. And Churchill had learned the hard way that the early moves after a war often shaped the next one. To him, the West stood at a fragile crossroads, and he feared that Truman, with his careful demeanor and quiet style, might not fully grasp the scale of the challenge. From the very first conversations at Potsdam, Churchill sensed caution in Truman's voice, where he wanted firmness. He sensed deliberation, where he wanted urgency, and he wondered, silently at first, whether the man seated beside him could truly rise to the demands of the new world taking shape. But history has a way of revealing what early impressions cannot. Before we go on, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you want more stories about overlooked turning points in the early Cold War, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Churchill's first doubts took root in the chaotic weeks following Roosevelt's death. Many in Washington shared his uncertainty. Truman had been vice president for only 82 days. He had not been briefed on major wartime secrets. He had not been included in high-level strategy sessions. When he learned of the Manhattan Project, he reportedly went pale and said little. Churchill, who had known the war from every angle, saw an American president stepping into one of the most complex transitions in modern history, with almost no preparation. To Churchill, this was not merely unfortunate, it was dangerous. He believed Truman might bend under Stalin's pressure, fail to act quickly enough, or retreat into caution at a moment when hesitation could reshape Europe in ways that would take generations to undo. Stalin, in Churchill's mind, was a man who sensed weakness instinctively, and the Kremlin's growing influence in Poland, Romania, and the Balkans was proof that Moscow was already pressing every advantage. As the conference at Potsdam unfolded, Churchill's concerns hardened. Truman listened carefully, asked direct questions, and refused to indulge in dramatic statements. But to Churchill, this restraint looked like uncertainty. Roosevelt had often hidden strategy behind charm and warmth. Truman hid strategy behind silence. Churchill mistook that silence for inexperience. Yet inside Truman's mind, something different was happening. He was studying every word, every shift in the conversation, every expression on Stalin's face. Truman's style was not to speak first. It was to understand fully. And slowly, he began to see the same patterns that Churchill had been warning about for months. But Churchill, having watched dictators rise firsthand, believed the West needed a leader who could not only understand danger, but confront it forcefully and immediately. He did not yet know Truman well enough to see that steel beneath the surface. Then, only days into the conference, something unexpected happened. The British election results arrived. Churchill had been voted out of office. One moment, he was Britain's voice on the world stage. The next, he was packing his bags and preparing to leave Potsdam. The transition was abrupt, almost surreal. Truman, who had just begun to build a working relationship with Churchill, watched him go with a sense of unfinished business. And Churchill left with an unspoken fear that the West's future might rest in hands not yet ready for the weight. Back in England, Churchill became increasingly vocal in private letters and meetings about the Soviet threat. He believed the United States still did not fully grasp the urgency, and he feared that Truman, despite his honesty and good intentions, might respond too slowly. But Churchill's view began to change in March 1946. When he traveled to Fulton, Missouri, he delivered a speech that would become one of the defining lines of the century. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Truman's presence beside him was not a coincidence. It was a sign that the new president was already taking the warning seriously, even if his style was quieter than Churchill's thunderous rhetoric. Still, Churchill's doubts lingered. He wanted declarations of strategy. He wanted clear red lines. He wanted the West to move fast before Stalin sealed Eastern Europe behind concrete and barbed wire. Truman agreed on the danger, but, in his mind, the path forward required something more than speeches. He needed to rebuild the world first. In 1947, Truman revealed a clarity Churchill had not expected. When he delivered the Truman Doctrine, he announced openly that the United States would support free peoples resisting oppression and intimidation. It was bold. It was direct. It was unmistakable. Churchill's first reaction, when he read the text, was a quiet realization. Truman had just taken the West's first definitive step into the Cold War. Yet doubts remained. To Churchill, declaring a doctrine was one thing. Sustaining it, politically, economically, and militarily, was another. And he worried that Truman might not have the stamina to follow through. But Truman's next move erased any question of commitment. The Marshall Plan. Churchill understood immediately that this was not merely an economic initiative. It was a geopolitical hammer. By rebuilding Europe, Truman was not just offering help. He was blocking the avenues through which Stalin hoped to gain influence. Factories reopened, cities rebuilt, economies revived. And everywhere, Soviet opportunities began to shrink. Churchill saw what was happening. Truman had not rushed into confrontation. He had built strength methodically, ensuring that when the West finally drew its line, it would stand on solid ground. But the defining test came in 1948. Stalin blockaded Berlin. It was the moment Churchill had feared would come, a direct challenge to the Western presence in Europe. And for Churchill, it was the moment that would reveal whether Truman would yield or resist. Churchill, now out of office but far from silent, expected Truman to confront the blockade with force. But he also feared that Truman might back down to avoid war. Instead, Truman made a decision that stunned even those who knew him best. He ordered the Berlin airlift, a solution so daring, so improbable, and so relentless that even Churchill had not considered it as the primary response. Truman's gamble bypassed the blockade without firing a shot. It supplied a city of 2 million entirely by air, day and night, in fog, snow, ice, and storms. And Stalin could not stop it without risking the very war he was trying to avoid. As the months passed and waves of aircraft roared over Berlin, Churchill watched from afar with a mixture of admiration and introspection. Here was the man he once doubted, the man he believed might falter, executing one of the most audacious humanitarian and strategic operations in modern history. When the blockade finally collapsed in 1949, Churchill admitted privately that Truman had made the right call. He began to say in speeches that Truman's firmness had preserved the peace, that Truman's steady hand had guided the free world through its first great post-war trial. He began slowly to revise the judgment he had formed at Potsdam. Because Churchill, who had spent a lifetime studying character, finally saw what Truman's quiet observers had known all along. Truman was not a man who led with words. He was a man who led with decisions. And decision by decision, he had reshaped the West's position in the Cold War. But Churchill's reevaluation did not end there. In 1951, when he returned to office, he met with Truman again, this time as two leaders shaped by years of crisis rather than two strangers meeting over a conference table. Their conversations were deeper, more reflective, more aligned. Churchill no longer saw Truman as a temporary steward. He saw him as one of the anchors of the West. The weeks that followed the Iron Curtain speech brought no dramatic showdown, no fiery telegrams or public declarations. Instead, the shift unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, in the margins of briefing papers and the tones of late-night conversations. Truman continued to work the way he always had, methodically, without theatrics, without the grand posturing that so many expected from a wartime leader. Churchill, ever the dramatist, found this infuriating. He watched from the outside as Truman built a strategy that looked nothing like Roosevelt's fluid balancing or Churchill's thunderous warnings. It was incremental, procedural, built from dozens of small decisions that few reporters bothered to cover. And yet, each was a stone placed deliberately in a wall the Soviets could not easily push through. One of the first came in March 1947, when Truman addressed Congress about Greece and Turkey. The speech was cautious, measured, lacking the rolling cadences that Churchill had perfected. Truman simply laid out the facts. The Greek government was collapsing under communist insurgency, Turkey was under immense pressure from Moscow, and the United States could not allow either to fall. To Churchill, the moment was electrifying. The American president, who had once seemed uncertain, now declared openly that the free world faced a global test. Truman's words did not thunder. They struck like a hammer laid down with calm finality. The United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation, and it would do so not with conquest, but with aid. This became the foundation of what the world later called the Truman Doctrine. Churchill read the transcript twice. He recognized something in it that he had missed months earlier. Truman's voice might lack the poetry of a British statesman, but it carried something else, a steadiness that did not depend on charisma. For months, Churchill had feared that Truman would shy away from confrontation, that he would waver when challenged. But here, Truman had drawn a line in the sand, and crossing it would cost the Soviet Union dearly. As the Greek aid package made its way through Congress, Churchill sent private notes to friends in Washington. He praised Truman's clarity, though in his own circle he still wondered whether the American president could sustain such resolve when the pressure mounted. Truman, for his part, never tried to emulate Churchill's style. He worked from the numbers, budgets, reports, cables, and the advice of seasoned cabinet members like George Marshall. The Marshall Plan itself, unveiled in 1947, was another example of Truman acting decisively without presenting himself as a grand architect. The idea was simple but enormous. Europe could not recover without American support. A starving, desperate continent would be fertile ground for communist movements and Soviet influence. If allies fell into chaos, no military alliance could save them. Churchill called the plan the most unsordid act in history. He meant it, but he also saw something deeper. Only one leader could make a program of that scale possible: Truman, the same man he had once dismissed as small, untested, accidental. Still, Truman and Churchill were far from a synchronized pair. Their disagreements remained sharp. Churchill believed in bold declarations and massive gestures. Truman believed in quiet persistence. Churchill liked to shape history with dramatic lines. Truman preferred to shape it with budgets and personnel. But the world, in its unstable condition, needed Truman's approach. He had no patience for imperial nostalgia or Churchill's strategic romanticism. His decisions came from a man who had grown up in a small Missouri town, who had seen the grinding realities of politics, who had served in the trenches of World War I, and who understood instinctively that power required restraint as much as courage. It was restraint that kept the Berlin crisis from spiraling out of control. When Stalin cut off all rail and road access to Berlin in 1948, Churchill's instinct would have been to confront the blockade with a forceful political declaration, or even a military escort. Truman instead chose something far more improbable and far more effective. He sent supplies by air. Coal, food, fuel, medicine, all dropped into a city surrounded by Soviet forces. The airlift seemed impossible at first. Even some American generals thought the idea was doomed. The numbers didn't work, the risks were too high, the winter too harsh. Churchill, watching from abroad, felt the familiar dread rising again. This was exactly the sort of gamble he feared Truman would mishandle. Too slow, too humble, too dependent on logistics rather than political shock. But he underestimated the same thing Stalin underestimated: Truman's endurance. Slowly, the airlift gained strength. Planes landed every few minutes, around the clock, through fog and ice. Children in Berlin learned to recognize the sound of each squadron. British pilots flew alongside American ones, creating an unlikely bridge of survival across the sky. Churchill received updates daily. They came from former aides, journalists, and friends in Parliament. With each report, his doubt eroded. Truman was not merely managing the crisis, he was mastering it. And by the spring of 1949, the blockade collapsed under its own failure. Churchill, reflecting later, admitted privately that he had misjudged Truman's political character, not his intelligence. Churchill had always known Truman possessed that. Not his decency, that was obvious, but his force. Churchill had imagined that force came from presence, rhetoric, and posture. For Truman, force came from persistence, precision, and the willingness to make unglamorous decisions that nonetheless carried enormous consequences. By the time Churchill returned to the prime ministership in 1951, the world Truman had helped shape was firmly in place. NATO existed. Western Europe was recovering economically. The Soviet advance had slowed, and the United States had proven time and again that it could act with resolve even when the path was narrow. Churchill arrived in Washington that year, expecting to meet a leader transformed by global fame. Instead, he found Truman exactly as he remembered, glasses perched on his nose, suit slightly rumpled, ready to talk policy without ceremony. The two men met in the Oval Office, no longer adversaries in caution and urgency, but partners in a world that had grown more dangerous and more dependent on Western unity. Churchill's tone that day was unusually warm. He praised Truman's resilience during the Berlin crisis, his courage in firing General Douglas MacArthur, and his steadiness through the Korean conflict. Truman listened politely, though he never celebrated his decisions. He simply explained them as necessary. When their meeting ended, a foreign correspondent waiting outside asked Churchill what he thought of Truman's performance as president. Churchill paused, removed his hat, and gave an answer that surprised the reporters around him. "I misjudged him at the start," he said. "But the true measure of a leader is not how he begins, but how he endures. And Mr. Truman has endured with iron." It was a rare admission from a man who almost never confessed strategic error. In the years that followed, Churchill reflected often on the moment he realized he had been wrong about Truman. It had not been in Potsdam, where Truman first faced Stalin, nor had it been during the Iron Curtain speech, when Churchill warned of Soviet expansion. It happened, he said, when the first British aircraft joined the American effort over Berlin. When he saw the quiet, tireless machinery of Truman's determination moving across the sky. When he understood that leadership could be measured in landings and tonnage, not speeches. By the time both men left the world stage, their relationship had become something historians still find unusual. They were neither friends nor rivals. They were two men who needed one another's strengths, even when they did not fully trust them. Truman had provided what Churchill no longer could: the resources, stability, and disciplined strategy required to face an immense adversary. Churchill had provided what Truman occasionally lacked: a sharp warning, a global perspective, and the moral vocabulary to frame the stakes of the Cold War. Together they formed an unlikely balance, and though their temperaments clashed, their aims aligned. The post-war world was shaped not by perfect unity, but by the tension between caution and urgency, between the man who spoke in thunder and the man who answered in plain prose. Truman would later say that he never wanted the presidency, never sought it, and never expected to be remembered. He believed he had simply done what the moment demanded. But Churchill knew the truth. The early Cold War could not have unfolded as it did without Truman's quiet resolve, and history's verdict eventually reflected that. As the decades passed, scholars began re-examining the early post-war years, reconsidering the decisions that prevented Europe from falling into chaos. Again and again, Truman's name surfaced as the pivotal figure whose steady hand prevented the worst outcomes. The Berlin airlift, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, the dismissal of MacArthur, the containment strategy that defined the Cold War. Each decision had once seemed uncertain, precarious, risky. Each had demanded a level of conviction that many believed Truman did not possess. Yet, he did. Churchill, in the end, acknowledged that Truman had been exactly the leader the moment required. Not a grand strategist like Roosevelt, not a rhetorician like Churchill, but a man who understood that leadership was not an act of performance. It was an act of responsibility. And so, the story of their early misunderstandings, disagreements, and eventual respect is more than a tale of two personalities. It is a reminder of how nations survive uncertain times by pairing caution with courage, vision with discipline, and rhetoric with resolve. So, now I want to hear from you. If you had stood in Churchill's shoes in those early post-war months, would you have doubted Truman's ability to hold the line? Or would you have seen in him the same quiet determination that eventually reshaped the West's strategy? And how do you think their contrasting styles helped define the Cold War's opening years? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more true stories from the critical early chapters of the Cold War, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.